The 1990s was truly an interesting time in the world of motorsports. In the United States, Tony George had established the Indy Racing League in a split from CART, bringing the Indianapolis 500 with it, and the popularity of American open-wheel racing tanked. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, the Australians found themselves in a similar situation with their most popular race. This is the story about how a television dispute led to 2 annual Bathurst 1000s. This is the story about the Australian touring car split. Over the past few months, I've gained a fairly large following after my segment on Racing Nation TV's video giving IndyCar fans an overview of Scott McLaughlin. And while I greatly appreciate the boost in attention, I unintentionally committed a crime towards petrolheads from down under. This saw the arrival of the Ford Mustang, Holden Murano. Clearly, for this video, I knew that a repeat offense simply wasn't an option, so I called up an Australian.
And called a not-so-Australian-sounding Australian he did. The Australian Touring Car Championship rose from humble beginnings. Like many touring car categories across the globe, it started with a production-based sedan class called Appendix J. The inaugural ATCC was held over a single race in 1960 at the New Blah circuit, and was won by David McKay in a Jaguar Mark I. The championship would run as a single race event up until 1969, when it would change to a multi-race championship. By this point, the championship had switched to the Group C and Group E touring car formulas, and it was dominated by the big V8 Ford Mustangs and Holden HK Monaro GTS 327s, which set the precedent for touring car racing in Australia, with cars driven by big V8s and fans usually slotting themselves into either the Ford or the Holden camp. Weirdly, while it seems so ingrained into the culture of Australian touring car racing, the fabled Bathurst 1000 was rarely ever actually part of an organised championship. In fact, up until it became part of the V8 Supercars Championship, the 1000 was only ever part of a championship a handful of times, perhaps the most high profile of which was when it briefly became a round of the World Touring Car Championship in 1987, which saw the European contenders go up against some of the regulars from the ATCC. And as you'll see later, this may have contributed to a number of issues. But basically, the ATCC and the Bathurst 1000 coexisted as such. From 1973 onwards, as before 1972 they ran under different rules, the drivers from the ATCC did their regular seasons, but would once a year take their cars to Bathurst for a standalone event. Legends like Peter Brock and Alan Moffat ruled the Australian touring car scene and were kings of the mountain in their Holdens and Fords. Things, however, got a little more complicated in the early 90s, particularly with the introduction of the Super Tourers, which is where the main story for today's video begins. Up until the mid-90s, the ATCC and the Bathurst 1000 in its numerous guises had always been multi-class. In 1993, 2 new classes were introduced into the Australian Touring Car Championship after Group A ceased to exist. These were the 5-litre V8 Fords and Holdens, which would later become known as V8 Supercars, and the 2-litre FIA Class 2 touring cars, which would later become known as Super Tourers. Now, up to this point in Australian touring car racing, most, if not all the classes had been able to compete for outright wins. However, the 5-litre cars were so much faster than the 2-litre cars that they had to be put in 2 different classes entirely, which eventually led to the formation of 2 different touring car championships in Australia. 1994 saw the inaugural season of the Australian Super Touring Championship, known then as the Australian Manufacturers Championship, while the ATCC continued with only Fords and Holdens. Much like what would happen to IndyCar in 1996 in the US, Australian touring car racing had been split in 2.
What is important to preface in this situation is that there were 2 major sanctioning bodies in 1990s Australian touring car racing: Touring Car Entrance Group Australia, or TAGA, and TOCA Australia. The former spearheaded the V8 supercar formula that we know today with Holden and Ford, while TOCA Australia was in charge of the Australian Super Touring Championship, featuring the 2-litre touring cars that were very popular in Europe. Starting in 1995, the 5-litre V8 supercars became the sole class to contest the Great Race. In November of 1996, TAGA partnered with the world-renowned sports promoter IMG in a joint venture that created the Australian V8 Supercar Company, or Avesco for short. By this point, some of you are probably yelling at me to get on with it and explain how a TV dispute plays into all of this. Just bear with me. The network that was responsible for broadcasting the Bathurst 1000 every year since 1963 was the 7 Network. The 7 Network held a contract to be the sole broadcaster of the race into the early 2000s. However, Avesco had signed a contract with Network 10 to broadcast all of their races from the 1997 season onwards. What resulted was essentially 2 rival networks that both somehow ended up with exclusive broadcasting rights to the Bathurst 1000, and neither network was willing to make a compromise. Avesco decided to pull their cars from the 1000 in order to satisfy their contract with Network 10. In January 1997, the announcement was made that October's traditional Bathurst 1000 would be held by the Super Touring cars and be broadcasted on 7 for a planned 6-year deal. 7 were allowed to broadcast the race, but they were lacking the star power of the Australian supercars and the big-name Australian drivers. The story goes that 7 financially supported bringing more entries to the race with teams and drivers from the British Touring Car Championship in order to create a bigger storyline for their race. Australian brothers Jeff Brabham and David Brabham took the win in their BMW 320i, but for many fans the Bathurst 1000 simply wasn't the Bathurst 1000 without the competition between Ford and Holden. Avesco saw the opportunity to host their own 1,000-kilometer race at Bathurst with the V8 supercars in order to give the fans what they pleased, and the inaugural Primus 1000 Classic was born. Held 2 weeks after the Super Touring Bathurst 1000, the inaugural 1000 Classic proved to be much more popular among the local fans, with Larry Perkins and Russell Ingall bringing their Holden VS Commodore to victory. The 2 sanctioning bodies repeated the same story in 1998, with reigning British Touring Car champion Rickard Rydell and Jim Richards winning the Super Touring Bathurst 1000 in a Volvo S40. Jason Bright and Stephen Richards, on the other hand, won the FAI 1000 in a Ford Falcon. In 1999, the Super Touring event had lost all of their famed international entries, and the race was shortened to 500 kilometers, which was won by Paul Morris in his BMW 320i. Meanwhile, at the FAI 1000, Stephen Richards defended his title alongside Greg Murphy in a Holden VT Commodore. By this stage, the 7 Network realized the Super Tourer Bathurst 1000 was nowhere near as successful as they had hoped it would be, and the event folded 3 years before the end of its initial contract. This handed the Bathurst 1000 title back to the V8 supercars, where it has remained to this day. And while it may not get as much international recognition as the kart IRL split of the same era, the lesson remains clear. If you want to organize a 1,000-kilometer race around Mount Panorama, don't think you'll beat the popularity of V8 supercars by bringing over some touring cars from Europe. That's going to cover it for this video. If you're new to the channel and enjoyed the story, I'd appreciate if you'd join me for more by subscribing. I have some plans for 2021 that I'll share soon, so feel free to follow me on Twitter as well if you don't want to miss any of the updates. The link is in the description. For now, take care, and I hope to see you in the next video.